Now, as we think about understanding the setting, how does the small church differ from the large church? How does it differ from how the larger or the mid-sized urban church operates? Even within an urban setting, even within a suburban setting, a church of 100 functions and operates vastly different than the church of 3,000 that is only 3 blocks down the road. And what are some of those dynamics? And how do we minister within the context? Well, that's what I want us to explore some in this session. As we think about the nature of the small church and how it operates today. The thing we need to remember in terms of the small church is that all ministry is cross-cultural. We've talked about that last segment. But again, we need to be reminded of the fact that as soon as we walk outside of the church that we grew up in and walk into another church, it's a cross-cultural ministry. That there are things in that church that are different from what we did in our church that we grew up in. And we need to understand those differences. There's a different culture. For about 8 or 9 years, I pastored 2 different churches at the same time. One was a denominational church. One was a non-denominational church. They were in 2 communities separated by about 5 miles. As we look at those 2 churches and as we ministered within those 2 churches, it was interesting to see how vastly different the mindset and the culture within the context of that church, those 2 churches differed. They were as different as night and day. In fact, if you walked into that church and you walked into the one and then you visited the next one the next Sunday, you would never guess that they were pastored by the same person. Because there was a completely different context, a completely different culture. The one was more of a little bit more of a progressive church. It was a younger church. The other was a very more of a traditional church. It was made up more of those who were retired individuals. The style of music was vastly different. And we need to understand that whenever we go into a new church, we're going cross-cultural in our ministry. And we need to relate to that. And part of that culture, part of that dynamic is what we call groupings. And groupings is what naturally bring people together. Now, as we look at society at large, we see a number of different groups that people have. Things that bring people together. And the way we divide people and place people in groupings. We also see that in the context of the church. That as we think about group identification, we see, for example, first of all, that gender roles have a significant influence. That each society has specific roles that each gender is given in that society that help define their roles and their relationship to one another and to others. And we see that in the church as well. That there are roles that are passed on from generation to generation based upon gender that help define the person's position and identification within that culture, within that grouping. For example, in urban areas, oftentimes these roles between the genders is less distinct. Where in the rural areas, they often have a much more of a traditional role. That their view of genders is more traditional, more established than the urban areas. They can also differ from community to community or from ethnic group to ethnic group, depending on their background. And so it's important for us as we go into a church, as we seek to lead the church, we need to understand what is the gender roles that people have. Can a woman teach Sunday school? Can she teach men in the church? Can she be involved in leadership in the church? All those are areas that are part of that individual church culture. A second area that in terms of grouping is that of age. That people have differing views about how they segregate by age. For example, we go into a more of an urban setting, or especially a larger church setting, that the only time a family will be together is in the car going and in the car coming home. But once they're at the church, they're divided according to age and separated so that the youth go into one direction, the parents go into another, the youth have their own service, the youth have their own activities, and then they come back and meet together at the car to go home. Whereas you go into a rural area, and it's much more intergenerational, so that there's not the separation by age. In fact, it's just the opposite. They don't want to be separated. They want to be brought together. And so age has a factor in terms of grouping. A third area is in terms of interests. What are interests that people have? Depending on the location and the setting, certain interests may predominate in terms of the formation of friendships and associations, even within the church. For example, those, if you're in a rural area, you may have those who are into hunting, and so they form a natural hunting friendship, an association, or fly fishing, or whatever the activity may be. It may be a job classification, such as farming, or whatever else might be differing jobs within the community, that influences the associations people have even within the church, how much they join together. We also see kinship playing a significant influence, especially in rural areas. That what determines one's position within the group is the bloodlines that they have within the group. One family may predominate, and so it becomes the tribal chief, if you would, and those who are connected to that family have more influence then in the church than those who are not connected. Certainly, the status in the community can also affect how people group and how they perceive one another. Someone who has a high position of status in the community may then automatically have a high degree of status within the context of the church. And so part of leadership, part of going in and understanding the culture is looking and saying, what is the groupings in the church? What is the perception that people have? How do they group one another? How do they associate with one another? Because that grouping influences who are the leaders. You see, every group, every congregation has natural leaders, people who are recognized by the congregation to be the leaders of that congregation. And that is oftentimes influenced by which groups predominate in the community and predominate in the church. And so as we go into the church, we want to be able to understand that. We want to be able to see and say, okay, well, what are the natural groupings? And how does that affect then leadership within the church? For example, a congregation may be located in a farming community where farming is the central tie that binds the community together, so that a person who is successful in farming then is seen as a natural leader in the group, even within the context of the church. And a person who is not a successful farmer, or maybe not a farmer at all, finds it difficult to attain levels of leadership. And so how are we going to work within that context as we go in and minister? So we need to understand the setting.